Welcome, colleagues, to CG seminar number 168, and great to be in the webinar format as we usually are these days. Another book symposium. This one is about teaching practices in a global learning environment, and we have the author with us, Hanne Tange, who's going to lead off, and she'll tell us a little bit about the book, but open up on some of the issues which it discusses. We have four excellent speakers for you on the topic of teaching practices in a global learning environment. And before we launch into their orations, let me take you through the webinar protocols. So remember that the webinar is recorded and will be posted on the CGHE website in due course, which usually means about 48 hours or so. And the YouTube version is then available to be hit upon, and we're finding increasing use is being made of our webinars in the YouTube format. We'll also post the transcription of the chat function during the webinar. Please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. We recommend using speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. Type your question into the chat, and perhaps you might want to specify which speaker you would like to answer your question. At the end of the presentation part, which will be after about 35 minutes or so, we'll then move to the Q&A, and I'll select the questions out of the chat. And I tend to favor those who come in early. If you hold back for the last 5 minutes or so before you type your question, you may miss out. That does happen. So do come in early. When you're invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Well, happy now to pass over to Hanne and look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for hosting this. It's absolutely great to present what is a truly global book to a truly global audience. I have a couple of slides with some pictures, and there's a lot of movement in those pictures, as you will find out. However, I believe I'm probably due, before I tell you a bit more about the pictures, to say, well, there is a structure to the book, and I have a feeling that the speakers following me will select what they would like to talk about, which I think they should be right to do, because this is their privilege. So I should probably outline their key structures. I think those who themselves have worked in a more Bourdieu-inspired way will recognize bits of Bourdieu in there, as there is a part addressing structures or structural changes, if you like, with a chapter on globalization, internationalization, organizational culture, a chapter on disciplines, a chapter on mobility, and a chapter on language. Then there is a section addressing concrete teaching practices. It wouldn't be fair to say I'm covering all the things I discovered. I just covered some that I believed people found very interesting to the practice. So those who were very dense in the data, and they are the question of how you design an international program, the question of academic socialization, the rules, the norms, the routines, geographies, the contexts in which knowledge is being produced and in which knowledge is being disseminated, multicultural teamwork, and finally, academic literacy or exams. So this is the key structure. This then allows somehow for me to connect what is the empirical work, which happens very much, I would argue, at the micro level, with a lot of voices in there. I haven't counted whether all the some 70 lectures I interviewed are in there, but I think I got a fair number of them represented. But somehow try to connect them into what is the global. And this is where, again, there is a lot of movement. And this is why I brought the pictures, because the pictures to me are movements. I wouldn't have done the book if I hadn't been an international student, ending up in Glasgow in 94, 95, which took me to doing my PhD in Glasgow, later on. And I think some of those experiences of being the Danish students who went to Glasgow to study something Scottish and being told, well, Hanne, you will not know because you're from Denmark. That kind of experience actually did something, and it's probably what originally prompted those reflections on what is knowledge. There are two other pictures, and I guess they are the lows and top, if you like, the good and the bad sides to international education in Denmark right now. I'm incredibly proud to see our international students, the global graduates coming out of our program, the way they present their learning, the way they say, well, being part of the international study environment, well, that is making a difference to us. On the other hand, we are also in a situation where we're seeing cuts on the number of international students in Denmark. The picture from Aalborg University, well, I'll get closed down, I'm your future. That was taken in 2018. Unfortunately, we're expecting a new round of cuts coming in a month or so. So this is very real to us. And I guess that story is also part of writing the book. I'll now talk you through three pictures, the pictures that are in the book, because they tell in many ways more than the words. So the first picture came out of my first interview study, which is really a study about language. And those who read the early articles will know all about that. I was writing about the transition that people experience when asked to talk or teach in English. I imagined I was only going to be working with language, and I discovered all of these other things. I discovered culture, hardly surprising as an interculturalist. But I also discovered that culture was used for a number of things that I didn't understand. So I created this random category called knowledge, and everything that didn't fit into language and culture in the analysis ended up knowledge. Then at some point I discovered that knowledge was certainly knowledge, but it was also organization. I discovered a whole lot about language policies and what language policies can do to people. The fact that there were people here who'd been told, well, we expect you to teach in English, because if you're not teaching in English, you're not an international scholar. And if you're not an international scholar, you're not talented to work in our program because we're teaching international X or international Y. So it was that thing, they all kind of connected. Organizational culture was part of the game because the way internationalization was realized was very different. In the first round of interviews, I visited, I think, 5 universities. I later added a British university. And every single institution, every single department, every single faculty would differ as to how they would realize international higher education. And then I added the layers, because these people, organization is only at the heart of it. But what happens in terms of language also connects to what happens at the supranational level, the global level, the national. What languages are considered prestigious? What languages are considered less important? Why is it that everybody's willing to publish in English? And once they're willing to publish in English, then they're also willing to include English medium literature on the course syllabi, which means that in a context such as the Danish, we've seen what used to be multilingual reading lists become really English reading lists. And what does that do? I've just today talked to students of international relations. Well, if they adopt English medium literature, they're also likely to adopt an American view on international relations. So it is doing something to the way we imagine the world. Finally, I try to connect them. And this is what I call the global practice-scape. And I think this is where you probably need to read the chapter in the book to kind of get to the details in it, because it's coming out of all the other chapters. I got the model as close as I could. I would probably have had 1 arrow, but my drawer did 2. But the idea is that some of this internationalization starts with a lecture. It's not that the lectures, for instance, in Denmark or Sweden, are forced to publish in English. They choose to publish in English because of the prestige attached to the English language. So they are part of creating the change that is internationalization. And I think this is too often overlooked. I think many of the more standardized works that we see on international higher education, for instance, published by some of the learning lab consultants, they always seem to take for granted that internationalization starts with the managers. And the managers then tell the deans that now we need more international education. So you tell your lecturers that they have to start developing international courses. But I think what I learned from these people I spoke with was they were actually many of them first movers on this. They didn't do international education because they were told to. They did it because they had an interest. Later on, then, people who were less willing internationalists might have been added, but originally, in the 1990s, I believe, in the case of Denmark, many of the people designing international courses, electives, they were volunteers. They were not pushed by the managers. And I think this is often overlooked in the literature. And I guess this is about it, really, for now. And I would now pass it over to other people. For I think that we agreed that Meeri was starting, didn't we?
I think we did. And
very sorry, I've muted myself. As Hanne, as well as the author of Teaching Practices in a Global Learning Environment, is also Associate Professor in English and Global Studies at the Department of Culture and Learning at Aalborg University in Denmark. And I think what you said will resonate strongly, Hanne, but especially what you said about language. I think many of our listeners will take that in. Now, Meeri Hellstén is our next speaker, and Meeri is a professor in international and comparative education at Stockholm University. She also chairs the funded research group ICER and lectures in the master's program in international and comparative, and also in the higher education teaching and learning program. Meeri.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Boy, oh boy, how do I do this in the time? Now I think I need to do this, don't I?
We can see it.
You can see it, and we're going. So in order to win time, I guess I have perhaps we'll do something a little bit differently. I've decided to, as an overview, to do a bit of a trajectory approach. So I'm not going to be describing the content. So those of you who were expecting me to go through this text in detail or chapter by chapter, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I've chosen 3 themes, looking back and looking at the book, being here and now, and looking forward. Where are we going? What are we doing with this? So what was, what is, and what may become? And so how did we get here? And I really enjoyed Hanne's start of the introduction to this presentation. Those of us who have been in the field long enough and who've been teaching and working with internationalization and teaching internationally might remember going back maybe, and I'm not meaning to exclude anybody here or highlight anyone ahead of anyone else, but in the 80s, I guess we started debating the instructional perspective of international teaching and learning. We had Volley and Ang's studies, and we have John Biggs doing good work in looking at student approaches to learning and studying, and then it moved on to the effects when there was this dramatic expansion of the field. The research also moved into discussing the import-export. How do we administer? How do we manage? How do we work the economy of international higher education? And then from there, the field moved into looking. There was a critical inquiry turn in the decade of the 2000s, in this century, where we started questioning how are we actually doing this, and is there another way in which we can look at these issues that involve teaching and learning, and also internationalization in important ways, not forgetting the policy aspect of that. And from that came the debates around with the emphasis on internationalization at home, and the common good of higher education, the common good of internationalization, to really put it roughly. And then recently, of course, we have the work by Jane Knight and John McNamara, looking at the classification systems. That is, how do we begin to synthesize and pull together a fragmented system that has so many vast understandings, connotations, conceptualizations, definitions of, and use of terminology that nobody really understands, and which makes communication about internationalization very, very difficult around the world. So, so from this, I want to contend that academics, we that are working in the field, we haven't really talked enough about teaching. Okay, so that's a little, just a little snapshot of how did we get here, and where we have been. And so moving then on to saying a few words about the book, and I first of all have to congratulate Hanne Tange for writing this and putting all the content that you've put in. And how did you think of all of this? I mean, it almost has everything in it that has been debated, and you have also embedded it into a ontological and epistemological frame, which is really appealing, because it is something that certainly has been lacking. So there is a culmination, you know, the debates around internationalization revolving around the academic or the community of international scholars, or the academics that are involved in it, in still being interested in to get it right. There is enough interest, regardless of all the critique and criticism and suspicion in some circles of international actually delivering and internationalization being high quality. And here I'm drawing on all the research that has highlighted, for want of a better term, the deficit models of international learning and teaching to some extent. So there is, what the book brings about is really helping us to understand the nitty-gritty or the intricacies that are involved, the difficulties, sitting with the trouble of understanding the difficult job of teaching and practicing international life, international academic scholarship, international teaching and learning. So where we are in this book, and again, I really congratulate you, Hanne, for putting it all together in such an engaging way, that I find myself, I've read the book through a couple of times, but now I'm finding myself just opening it up. And when I open it up, I find things that inspire me and motivate me in the work. And certainly there is food for thought there, and also material and resources to use in coursework, and we certainly will be doing that as well. So I think that it goes beyond the expected, and it does, because it uses that evidence that also is grounded in epistemology, and the framing, the contextual framing of that. I think it is a book that I'm hoping will be around also for a long time. So I'm going to finish with this and point towards the future, and point to where we might be going with all this. You know, we've been in the field now for what, 40, 50 years at least in earnest, and of course since the expansion, we have thought of many different ways, and I don't quite know if we have, to what extent we have succeeded as yet in providing quality international higher education in our universities. But now we are, of course, in the era of the Agenda 2030. We are now talking about sustainable internationalization. So I would like us to maybe just think about how can we use the knowledge in this text to point us towards sustaining internationalization and to ask what does that mean? What might it mean for us working in the field? Does it mean for us to increase English medium of instruction, EMI? Is the idea of bilingual, multilingual universities indeed something that we can harness and work with? We are certainly discussing that in Sweden. We are certainly discussing it in non-English speaking, native English speaking countries. It is an issue also which Hanne is bringing up in the book. So, or is it about increasing, as Hanne says, the multi-sided, and I particularly like this, multi-sided, multi-scalar teaching practice, and I'm hoping that I will get Hanne to describe more of how you're seeing this at work in the description that you give and the debate that you make in the text. So, or is it about, as you also say, the doings and the sayings and the relatings in what we do, what we intend to do when we internationalize? And lastly, I will finish it off simply by saying, well, read it. It will take us to a journey, and I certainly will use it as a reference book for many years to come. There is so much in it. So thank you.
Simon, you're muted, I think.
Again, that's twice in one webinar. Terrible. Meeri, thanks very much for that. I mean, I think we're going to go on talking about teaching, and we'll go on talking about internationalization, and we'll remain poised between centrality and marginality. You know, international will remain not quite at the center of everyone's thinking, but too important to be treated as largely irrelevant to most people. I mean, since the 1990s, it's been like that. You know, the wave of globalization, internationalization in the 90s did change things. Connectedness changed things. Greater mobility and travel changed things, and we're still in that situation now, where that change is there, and it's at times we're central to institutional strategy, at times we're not. What we have a sense, I think, that the national dimension in policies probably reasserted itself and its influence over international dealings in the last decade or so, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. At the same time, we're more connected. We're more connected than ever. And when mobility returns, physical mobility returns, I think we'll see tremendous fluorescence of that activity as well. Miguel Antonio Lim, pleasure to introduce Miguel, colleague from way back now, and now a senior lecturer in education, co-research coordinator and co-convener of the Higher Education Research Network at the Manchester Institute of Education, which is churning out substantial work in our field and has already figured in our webinar program. So Miguel, delight to welcome you back.
Thank you so much, Simon. And well, thank you to Hanne. I was set an enjoyable, but I felt almost impossible task to really draw out what I really enjoyed and what I found insightful about this your new book in 5 minutes, which is the impossible part. The rest of the part was the enjoyable bit. And I think that it was enjoyable because I think the book has several strengths. I think chief of which Meeri has already pointed out, which is that it's talking really about, I think, an underserved topic in the field, which is really about teaching, right? Like global practices in teaching or internationalization in teaching, kind of the teaching side. I think there is a lot of work in our field about kind of research and the kind of internationality and globalization of research, but teaching is perhaps the underserved sibling in this conversation. So thank you so much, Hanne, for doing that. I do think that the book has several strengths, as Meeri mentioned. I mean, I think chief of which is just really the clear narrative, the clear storytelling. I'd noticed, for instance, the use of like just very useful things like Ciceronian triplets, you know, like things come in threes and they make it easy to remember some of the points in the different chapters. I do think that it's well grounded in a really strong literature review, and there's also ongoing empirical work that I see informs many of the chapters. One of which I'll speak about is, I think, drawing on 68 interviews I think that Hanne and her colleagues have done with practitioners in the field. And more than that, perhaps I'm not sure whether Hanne had well expected this or given perhaps publication timelines, probably not. But I do think that it speaks to a really interesting moment when many of us are having to reflect on our own teaching practices and internationalization and mobility practices in this period of, well, in the pandemic. And several of us are teaching internationally or working internationally without geographically moving. Some of us are teaching students all across the world in different ways than we used to. Some of us are having to reflect on these things. Students themselves are actually also reevaluating, I think, what global teach or what international teaching, or in our case, what UK teaching is about. Do they need to come to the UK? Um, is it still a desirable option? So I think lots of things are in play, and I think the book helps us to reflect on some of these things. But yes, to try and finish within the 5 minutes, just like any good book, I'd focused, and I guess I'd gravitated on the parts that I felt some connection to, and these were in two chapters. Chapter 3, which is to speak of a Ciceronian triplet entitled Globalization, Internationalization, and Transnationalization, and Chapter 5, which is about, sorry, what's the global and local teachers? Yeah, and in between those two topics, another great chapter on disciplines, and I mean there are great chapters everywhere, but one can't talk about everything that one wants to. Uh, and one of the things that I just felt connected to is just my own experience in one of the contexts that Hanne studies, which is Denmark. So 7 years ago, I moved to Denmark and I spent 3 wonderful years there working with, among others, Sue, who's also on this panel, thinking about issues of mobility, thinking about global higher education. And even then, I'd realized now, especially where I'm sat from, that the emphasis was really more on research and kind of like these uh, uh, like transnational and international strategies, and perhaps the teaching side and particularly the students were well de-emphasized or less emphasized. So in any case, I'd enjoyed these two chapters because Hanne speaks about um, Danish challenges and conundrums about or things that are happening in Denmark that illustrate these challenges to this global learning environment, and in two particular themes that I'll in fact hopefully ask Hanne to comment on later, the themes of de-internationalization and localization. But to go to those 2 points and how I'd really felt connected to these two chapters is that first I reflected on my own experience as I would say, a global teacher and a global educator, both on the teaching side, but also trying to think in terms of the students in my classroom. So as is well known to most of the people in this webinar, the UK, where I'm speaking from, is a highly, I would say, marketized environment, and there's a large some would say dependence, and some would say large outreach to international students. So the UK hosts a large number of international students. And Hanne quotes the difficult position that international students face in places like the UK, which is that they can be presented as deficit learners. So here she draws on Tannock, among others, that for instance, students who may not come from native English speaking countries, that they're seen as, oh, you're a deficit learner, you don't speak English perfectly, and here we are going to civilize you and tell you how to use an Oxford comma. And on the other hand, there's also perhaps a discourse where they're seen as an asset. Well, clearly there's, in the UK, there's a financialization of the value of international students. But in some cases, they're also presented as a value for to contribute to a multicultural society. So they're, even then, they're seen as, in a way, they're presented in an instrumentalist way, that we have them because, one, they bring money, and two, they are helping us to build our trade links, for instance, post-Brexit, to the new emerging economies, to China, to, you know, the BRICS, Brazil, you know, other parts of Europe. Um, and so it can be difficult, I guess, for an international student to be put that in that position. And for those of us who are, I think, committed to ethical internationalization as educators, it also puts us at a, you know, it challenges us to really try to think about our practices and our institutions. Hanne does go on to mention that, I think she says that, well, you know, like, teachers are not inert, right? Like, they're not inert, and they're not uh, uh, neutral. And she even mentions that academic staff, I quote from the book here, are most enthusiastic about internationalization in institutional cultures where they are involved as key drivers in the process of internationalizing research and education. So she also mentions that, well, basically, if they don't feel that this is being done in a good or ethical way, then they're not on board. And this is something to reflect about and think about. The other thought that I had to reflect on, or that connected with me, is really my experience also as I would say, as a mobile academic. So, as I said, I lived in Denmark. I mean, this is my second stint now in the UK. I've also worked in France and other parts of Europe, and I'm originally from Southeast Asia, and I've worked around that region as well, in higher education, administration, management, and teaching. So it's been an interesting journey for me as well. And here I draw on another colleague's work, Corina Balaban, and I'm trying to link that work to what Hanne is mentioning here about the different forms of homelessness that one can experience as a mobile or in this global kind of environment. And Corina Balaban speaks about kind of this mobility and the linked homelessness, not just in terms of geographical mobility, but also in terms of disciplinary mobility, as well as cross-sectoral mobility. So those are things I'd personally experienced by being in, well, in jobs in higher education, administration, and management, and moving to the kind of research and teaching side. And also from the disciplinary side, so I'd started out in economics, moved into political science and public policy, and here I am now in education, and specifically in higher education. So there are things that I'd really, well, just reflected on and connected with. And also, of course, in that chapter on global and local teachers, Hanne talks a lot about, like, how Denmark attracts international workers, and where they go on to. And speaking of these hierarchies, I'd noticed that in my own trajectory, coming to Denmark and perhaps moving from Denmark to the UK in some of the data that Hanne herself has seen. Uh, but maybe just to finish, I'd like to perhaps ask Hanne a little bit about one work that is cited in the work, which is one of Hanne's work that is forthcoming, to reflect on this, perhaps the links or tensions between de-internationalization, which she observes in Denmark, and localization. And by this, just briefly, localization, Hanne thinks about international teachers who in principle are the standard bearers of internationalization, but she also talks about the ways that they conform to their host countries, how they localize their teaching and their ideas. And so it made me reflect, actually, when I do teach, am I bringing my internationality to the classroom? Am I bringing my French or Danish, Filipino or Singaporean experience? Or am I just teaching as, am I mimicking, am I just being an isomorphic clone of my British or English colleagues in the way that I teach? And it made me reflect on that. And so I thought that, is this localization linked to de-internationalization, which Hanne talks about, or is this a threat to this project, or is it in fact something that is to be welcomed, because Hanne also speaks about the value of local knowledges. So that's hopefully something that we can discuss in, well, in questions and answers. Thank you so much again for the book, and thank you to CG for hosting the webinar about it.
Thanks, Miguel. And our final speaker is Sue Wright. Now, Sue is the Professor of Educational Anthropology at the Danish School of Education at Aarhus University in Denmark. That's a very modest and straightforward introduction to Sue. Sue's a centrally important person in our field. She's organised many of us many times, and in collective activity. Her commitment to networking and to working together in the common interest is, as well as the intellectual projects that underpin that orientation, is profound and very important to us. Sue.
Thank you. I think I'm unmuted.
Yes,
thank you very much for that generous introduction, Simon, and thank you for the invitation to comment on Hanne's book. It's a privilege. The only way I can describe the book is that it's big. I mean, not in weight, you know, how people sometimes hold up a thesis and say, well, it's heavy enough. No, it's the right weight, but it's big in the number of projects and the years of work that have gone into it. And it's big, as others have said, in the scope, and in particular, the way that it spans from an empirical base to theoretical sophistication. That is fantastic. But it's also big in a third way, which the other two commentators have mentioned, but this is what I'm going to focus on. And that's its importance politically right now. So what I want to do is be very Danish, and I don't know whether I'm being international or local in Miguel's terms, but I want to really highlight the relevance of this book to a country like Denmark, which is in some ways peripheral to internationalization, partly because of its language, partly because it thinks of itself as a little country on the edge of Europe. But I think that what Hanne is doing is incredibly important as part of especially European debates on the future of internationalization right now. So that's really what I'd like to focus on. The really important thing, and both the other speakers have mentioned this, is that this is looking at processes of internationalization where the academics, the teachers, are active agents in the process rather than being done to. They're the ones who are filling the space and filling the opportunities to create international projects. And I think that's a really important issue, because on page 163, there's a really nice, simple definition of internationalization as the transformation from inward-looking national conditions to externally orientated international focus. And in that process, the environment of the university is transformed. And I think that's a really, really important point, because it's not just the teacher teaching internationalization. That process is part of transforming the environment of the university. So my question is, who is doing that? And Hanne's answer is very much focused on the bottom-up process of the academic aspirations and the ways in which teachers do that, interacting with policy, obviously, but it's that focus. And I would like to bring in a historical trajectory here to think about how that's happened in Denmark in particular, because in the start of really a new phase of internationalization in Denmark in 2003, universities were reformed in order to make them drivers of Denmark's competitiveness in the global knowledge economy. And this law was followed up by setting up a policy framework which involved a whole series of initiatives, including setting up innovation centers around the world, where the idea was to attract the best research partners, whether they be other universities or companies, and the best students from around the world. And this was obviously a government-driven approach. But the point I'm making is that that framework that was set up in a whole series of ways was like a space that enabled, it opened up space for academics to fill that with their own initiatives and their own aspirations. And I think Hanne's book catches that moment when there was that possibility for academics to think carefully about what they meant by internationalization, to think carefully, I mean, not as carefully as Hanne's done it with her very, very beautiful framework, but to think through various aspects of how they wanted to develop their programs in terms of the kinds of students they wanted to attract, the kinds of curriculum, the kind of teaching methods, the kind of international learning communities they wanted to create. Academics did it in different ways, but those were the kind of things that were the buzz. There was a big, big shift in 2013 when the EU court made a ruling that EU and EEA citizens who work part-time in Denmark are eligible for Danish student grants. And they are probably the most generous student grants in Europe, which is one of the reasons why we attract international students. And all the political parties made an agreement to set a ceiling on the amount of funding that could go to international students. And nobody thought about it because at that point there were 441 EU students working in learning in Denmark. But by 2017, that had risen to 11,078. So from 400 to 11,000 in a matter of 4 years. And suddenly the ceiling that kicked in. Now that had been really brought about by the politically strong position of the Danish Folk Party at that point. But the policy was activated by a liberal conservative government. And suddenly, at the end of 2018, they announced that universities had to cut 1,200 places on their English language courses. Now, the reason for this was they wanted to cut down the number of English, what they called English-speaking students. Most of them aren't English first language students, but they called them English-speaking students. And the reason for that was that that was the only legal way they had to cut out EU students from Danish education, who would therefore not be able to take courses and therefore not be able to draw on the grant. But that definition covered fee-paying international students, as well as the EU students. It covered students who had grown up abroad and done their school education abroad. That came under English language education as well, English-speaking students who maybe had moved to Denmark through marriage or something. They were also excluded, and refugees. So this very, very broad definition of English-speaking students was suddenly cut out. Now, the way they did it was by saying that each university had to cut a certain number of places. And now, as Hanne mentioned, the numbers have risen again, and the Social Democrat government, who was so critical of the Conservative Liberal government doing this in the first place, have now endorsed it, and they're about to bring in another set of cuts. So this de-internationalization, in the sense of undoing international efforts, is a really live issue in Denmark, and as I'm hearing, through an international project in other parts of Europe at the moment. And the point I want to make here is that the government made these strategies in terms of numbers. Cut 800 students, cut 150 students, cut any number, they just threw numbers at the universities, and they gave the universities notice in September, October 2018 to cut their intake for the following year when the courses were already advertised, the admissions already started. And what happened was that All sorts of things were cut, including the 2 courses that Hanne and I had both been in our respective universities building up over many years and had enormous emotional connection to, as well as intellectual connection to, which were really well thought out international programs in all respects. But they were just slashed. Ours was closed completely, and well, the numbers of international students was cut completely, and Hanne's also cut. And the point here is that what started off as a policy framework that provided the space for academics to use the kind of ideas that Hanne's book is about, to develop international education in well thought out ways, has been closed down in what one of our leaders called commando way steering. Now the government sets the rules and the leaders implement them, and we get told that our course is cut as from next year. And that's a profound difference, because it cuts out the space for the academics to be exercising the kind of initiative that Hanne is describing. And it also cuts out any kind of debate about what is internationalization and how should it be conducted, which Hanne's book is all about. So this is why I'm saying it's a big book. I think it's such an important book that we really get politicians and policymakers to start thinking about what is internationalization from the teaching and learning point of view, not just in terms of the cash cow point of view or the trade relations point of view, which is often the way they think, but in terms of the approach thought through by teachers, which is what Hanne's book is about. So that's why I'm coming at this book in a slightly different way to the other 2 who've done good summaries of the chapters and the teaching aspects of it. But I think the relevance of this book politically and in policy making and in the kind of policy that provides a framework that enables academics to be able to take this thinking into practice, I think it's incredibly important. So thank you for the opportunity to comment on it. You're muted, Simon, again. Simon,
Yes,
mute.
yes, sorry about that. It was a salutary example, of the reassertion of the nation state, wasn't it? And as you say, that's happening elsewhere as well.
Can I just add, I think it's not just nation state, it's a form of ethno-nationalism. It's, Denmark is for white Danes. It's that kind of, it's not just a nation state. Mm-hmm. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. You've colleagues, we've heard from Hanne, Meeri, Miguel, and Sue. I might start the Q&A if I can, Hanne, by asking you. You've put teaching practices in a global learning environment out there. This discussion helps, I think, draw attention to the book. That's very good. And this is partly, I think, also attuned to what Miguel was asking you. What's next for you? What's the next project? And you might reflect also on Miguel's direct question to you there as well. Hanne.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the very nice comments, and thank you for the questions. And yes, what's next? Well, next is completing the anthology we're currently working on. So that's a very practical next coming up, which actually does. The one thing about doing a book like this, it's very much a synthesis of a book. So for instance, the chapter that Miguel was kind enough to praise about the local and the global teachers, that is coming out of a book chapter that's quite a lot longer, and which doesn't contain more of the data in there, because the problem of doing so much in so little space is that a lot of the method is missing, and I'm aware of that, and a lot of the themes could have been developed a lot more. It's far too neat, I guess. The real world is not so neat. So that's coming next. Another thing that might be coming next, and this is where I'm still trying to work out whether I feel I'm up to it, but I'm considering turning the thing in the book together with the article into some kind of, doing the Danish doctorate, as a matter of fact, because I think the final synthesis ought to be made with the space necessary to do the methodological and the theoretical development. because I think I certainly agree, and I understand Meeri's, well, how do the two connect, the multi-sited and the multiscalar? And I think it deserves more space, that kind of development. But I'm not sure I would have got a book contract with Routledge if that's what I suggested to them. I think they were more up for the what kind of more reader-friendly kind of format. And so I went for the reader-friendly to a very large extent. And I was actually very pleased that they were happy enough for me to include methodology and theory development in there, because that was kind of coming in late minute, not in the book proposal. As regards the question with de-internationalization and localization, I think it's important. I see them as different. I think I'm aware that the terminology might be a bit confusing. Sue and I are still struggling on the de-internationalization. Right now, we're stuck with that term, I believe, because we haven't found a better one for it. But the de-internationalization is relating specifically to taking the international out of international education, if you like. In our case, taking the students out, removing, in our program, the language and international studies, we have no more international students. Just talked about this morning, and we're still trying to find a strategy for retaining a global image for that program, because it does affect the kind of students they recruit. So we're still working on what to do with it. So taking de-internationalization is taking the international out. And one thing is what we do, we're seeing it with attempting to introduce the ceiling on EU students in Denmark. I think the UK is going through similar things with Brexit. I think we've seen similar things in the Netherlands. So we're seeing really around the world, at least in some places, attempts to control internationalization at the national level. I don't know enough about Australia, but I'm aware certainly that there are debates over the number of Chinese students. So we've certainly seen things there as well. So it does seem to be a growing debate over, well, is the university nation building or is the university international? And I think for many of us working in academia, and not only working in international higher education, I speak for colleagues from natural science, from engineering, we take for granted the international, but we forgot to talk to the politicians, and the politicians no longer take for granted the global university. So I think a lot of things are happening, and this is, unfortunately, I think most people in this forum would probably agree on that. This is probably what we're going to be spending the next 10 years doing, trying to come to terms with the return of nationalism in higher education. Localization was, it came out. What was interesting about the interviews was actually, because I've read a lot about these articles about how easy it is to travel, and you can get a job as a scholar, you can work anywhere, and I have a set of notes, I talk with them in 3 continents and all that kind of thing. What struck me was I had a couple of interviews, only a couple of them, where the lecturers were describing what I call noise. They had a meeting with the Danish students, and the Danish students were literally complaining about the approach taken by the international lecturer. So it seemed as if there was evidence that actually, because what particularly the more experience of the interviewees, where he said, well, then I changed my practice. So there seems to be that people are actually adjusting to the teaching culture. And I think that's been overlooked in the literature, because many of the internationalists, and I guess we all are to a large extent, we've been so enthusiastically celebrating the fact that science is global that we've forgotten that teaching, education may not be global. And I think this is where we get that interestingly noise emerging, that people arrive and they expect, oh, business students are the same all over. But the business students, if the Danes are the majority in the classroom, then they feel they have the right to tell the international recruit how to do things, particularly if the international recruit speak with an accent in English that's not either a native speaker accent. You still have a priority, there's some privilege attached to that. Or, they don't speak Danish. So, they smell a rat with these international recruits, and they find a way to complain if they're not happy with the approach taken. And I think I've certainly heard people say in the past that Danish students can be a bit scary because they're used to being very egalitarian with people, at least some of the stories I've heard, and maybe a stereotype, but this idea of disciplining, I think, is quite interesting. And this is what is behind localization. I don't know if that answered the question, Miguel.
Well, I think we're continuing the discussion also that came from Sue, and that's very useful. Katharina Wright, I think, would like to contribute at this point.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, so my name's Katarina, and I'm actually Danish and American, and so it's really interesting to hear all this discussion of internationalization in the context of Denmark in particular, because I sort of similarly have seen it as Sue mentioned, being kind of a country that sees itself as sort of on the edges of Europe and hasn't played a huge role in the international stage. So it's interesting to hear that's changing. I guess my question was, Sue mentioned this de-internationalization and what seems to me a rather sort of crude policy making happening in the case of Denmark, and trying to kind of control the number of international students. So I guess, what do you see above and beyond writing texts like your book, Hanne, or like what might academics or other advocates do to maybe not counter that kind of de-internationalization, but at least shift the debate to something that I think is maybe more intellectually honest, and so that we can avoid these cruder policy reforms and actually have a more thoughtful and balanced discussion about the role of international students and staff in higher education.
That's a what can we do question, Hannah, I think.
Yeah. I think actually Sue kind of touched upon that as well. I think you have to watch describing what happens in Denmark as crude. I think it's important to take into account the fact that this is one of the few countries where students actually get grants from the state. So it's a money thing, really. So if you want to change the policy, and if you want Denmark to open up to international students, the solution is you abolish Danish student grants. Then there's not a problem, because the question was never free higher education. International students have been coming before the 2013 policy, where the European Union students won the right to get grants. But I think describing what happens in Denmark is crude. If you're in a country where you don't have scholarships and people pay for education, I don't think that's quite fair, because this is actually because a situation created by the fact that you have a state finance higher education, so students can study for free and they can get a grant. So it's not nice what's happening, but kind of you can see the economics of it. There's a reason.
I think Miguel's been trying to get in, so do come into the discussion at this point if you can, Miguel.
Yes, thanks. Just to say, Hanne, thank you so much for the response about the links between de-internationalization and localization. And I think your groups, I know that Sue's Research Center also has another event on that theme, and also about the Danish case. Maybe just on the point about on COVID and nationalism. So how do you think? Well, there are already the commentators who are saying that COVID will result in more nationalist policymaking, and that will seep through into education. I could speak about the UK case here, but I'd rather hear from you first. But maybe just a little bit of future kind of orientation, and could you let us know, based on your research, how you think COVID will affect the conclusions of your book, particularly with education policymaking for teaching and nationalism in that context?
This is where, and I think Sue, Meeri might come in, because they might actually have a different experience. I don't actually think COVID-19 is going to do a lot in the long run in terms of how higher education is organized with us. And again, this is because we're not competing for international students to charge fees. So unlike Britain, United States, Australia, where clearly this is creating all sorts of trouble, because say if you're recruiting a large number of fee-paying students from China, of course, when you're closing the borders to them, they're not getting what they paid for. So that's going to create difficulties. But in Denmark, where it's state financed, it's a case of replacing perhaps European Union students not applying with Danish applicants. So the universities will get the same number of spaces. So we don't actually have a whole lot of overseas students. We mainly have European students. And then we have quite a big group of Nordic students. And Sue said a bit about the confusion with who's actually included in international students. Right now, we're looking at the numbers, and the politicians are telling us, oh, the number of SU claiming students, it's on the rise, the grants claiming students, and that's a problem. the way they try to keep these students out is by forcing a policy of, well, for our BA program, it's at the high school level A, which is the highest level you have to get for high school in Danish to enter. What's hidden in those numbers is the number of Swedish students. So actually students from Sweden, of course, can continue entering Danish higher education, and they've been doing that for years, and they probably will not be kept away by this entrance requirement, because for a student from Sweden, they could probably manage Danish A relatively easy if that was what they desired. So it's kind of, so I'm not sure what Corona, we're going to get more digital teaching, but I think that's the same for everyone. And we're afraid that our managers are using it to cut expenses and that kind of thing. But I'm not sure the COVID-19 itself is going to do a lot to student recruitment. But I don't know if your impression is different, Sue.
Thank you.
I think we'll wrap up soon, but perhaps we could have another word from Meeri and from Sue before we do. Meeri.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion. I realize that we're only touching on the issues. We would need at least a week's program to address in any great detail any of these issues. These have been ingrained in the system for a very long time, and what we're seeing now is not even a culmination of what has been going on, but also a profound change. I'm sitting in Sydney at the moment, and I'm here strangely enough in this current time on a sabbatical, working at Sydney University on these issues, and I'm seeing here the massive decline that the pandemic has caused in this country. It is a sad. It is just sad to observe the massive cuts in the economy and the funding of the higher education and the universities. It is hitting Australian higher education from many different perspectives, and so where are we going with this? It was certainly international student numbers have dwindled, and we are following whether digitalization online is going to provide, but I'm not sure that is going to. I don't know whether that is whether we're going to see that increase. In Sweden, we're still in the process of a new national strategy that is still being worked. It is one of the most welcome national strategies in higher education in terms of internationalizing it. And what we have seen, we haven't really seen a big difference during this year. So I am not suspecting that Sweden is going to be affected, but it might be affected at the policy level. And what is happening in Sweden is the sustainability and the Agenda 2030 will affect people's consciousness. So we're finding here that our clients, or if we want to call them, if we talk economic terms, or we want to call students clients, in a neoliberal sense, whether we want to or not, what we're finding is that there is a consciousness whereby mobility might be affected from the point of view of the individual choice. So that might force higher education to think and rethink and do things differently, to provide internationalization at home, to think of entirely new, different ways to deliver international education, I think.
The effects of the pandemic are very uneven by country. And in Australia, we see a system which had 1/3 of its students international, 1/3, that's as internationalized as you can get in quantitative terms. It suddenly will see a dramatic drop to half or less of that. And I think will take some years to recover while mobility picks up elsewhere more quickly. And the Australians are suddenly facing 1 in 10 staff positions cut and massive for retrenchment, decline of the research effort, science will go down, lots of other things, which shows how fragile internationalization is, you know, in certain circumstances. Sue, I think you have the last word.
Well, thank you very much. And I think thinking of the effects of the pandemic on universities, I'll be able to answer that question in a year's time, because the European project that I'm running at the moment is doing a 10-country study of and Miguel's involved in this, of the pre-existing conditions that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. I think the issue of sustainability that Meeri raised in its various forms, economic and social, is a crucial question. I think the mission of universities is changing as a result of the pandemic. I think, especially where you had Denmark still clinging to this idea that the universities were there to be instrumental drivers of a knowledge economy. This is widening now, I think, to a much bigger understanding of universities having social and political roles, looking at not the responsibility, but the potential contribution that universities can make to trying to counter some of the inequalities that have become really evident through the pandemic. So that's like the role, but internally, the organization of the universities, I think what I've been seeing is the move that I mentioned that came with de-internationalization, the strengthening of the top-down decision-making systems. I think the pandemic has exacerbated that. The ability of leaders to assert themselves and say, this is what we're doing. This is, and of course, in a situation like that, you need leaders to be able to make quick, responsible reactions. But it's more and more closing down the space for academics and students to be contributing to what used to be called the university, although now the university tends to refer to the leaders and we're the workers. But to try and reassert an idea of the university being a collegial space of leaders, academics and students and administrators, I think that is getting harder and harder. And I think there's a rise of nationalism, of this kind of neo-nationalism, in the strangest ways. And just to finish off the kind of the funny side of what Hanne and I have been talking about, the main character of English-speaking students in the Danish, if you follow the Danish definition of English-speaking students, most of them are German.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Hanne. Your book has provoked a really excellent discussion, and thank you for your responses in that discussion, which I thought were really enlightening. Thank you to Sue and Meeri and to Miguel, and we look forward to seeing all of you back again in our webinar program in future. Tomorrow we have another webinar. We're titling it The Secret Life of International Student Recruitment Agents. So now we move to the dark side, the more commercial aspects of the international education sector. But I should expect we'll have quite a lot of people in that webinar. We have our speakers from UK, New Zealand, China and United States. So I think we'll be once again discussing the effects of COVID-19 on international students and international education. Thank you all again. Apologies to McQueen Sum. We couldn't get your question in because it came in late, but do come in back tomorrow and ask another one. We look forward to hearing from all of you again. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.